In the final months of a crumbling empire, when death was glorified and doubt was treason, one man was given wings, not to return, but to vanish. What if a kamikaze pilot disobeyed? What if the last whisper of defiance was never heard, until now? This is not a tale of honor. It's a story buried under silence, shame, and cherry blossoms. The wind howled across the icy plain as snow drifted over the jagged rubble of what had once been a bustling Estonian village. It was January 1944, and the Narva Bridge, once a simple crossing between east and west, had become a crucible of survival and resistance. As the Soviet juggernaut surged westward, seeking to reclaim territory seized by Nazi Germany in Operation Barbarossa, a forgotten chapter of the war unfolded in this remote outpost on the banks of the Narva River. There, a hastily formed band of Estonian partisans, local farmers, disillusioned Wehrmacht defectors, and escaped Soviet POWs forged an uneasy alliance to hold the bridge, a bridge neither side considered strategically vital until it became too costly to lose. The Germans had retreated in chaos from the Soviet onslaught, leaving behind only minor units and volunteers in the Baltics. One such unit, known as the 88th Local Defense Battalion, was left in charge of securing Narva Bridge, under the command of Captain Matthias Tam, a former forestry officer turned soldier. Tam, an Estonian nationalist, had no illusions about the intentions of either Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. He had seen firsthand what both regimes could do to his people: mass deportations, executions, forced conscription. With the Germans abandoning the town and the Soviets fast approaching, Tam made a fateful decision: they would not retreat. Not yet. By January 14th, the temperature had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. Food was scarce. Ammunition was scarcer. But the narrow stone bridge spanning the frozen Narva River offered a choke point, and Tam believed they could hold it. With only 120 fighters, including a few Red Army escapees who had no desire to return to Soviet ranks, Tam laid out a desperate plan. They would rig the approach to the bridge with mines, use the surrounding buildings as sniper nests, and, most controversially, collapse the forward span of the bridge at the last possible moment if overwhelmed. On January 17th, the Red Army's 48th Mechanized Brigade reached the outskirts of Narva, expecting little more than a cleanup operation. Instead, they encountered a fierce resistance. Machine guns hidden in collapsed roofs opened fire. Soviet T-34s found themselves bogged down in deep snow or ensnared by makeshift anti-tank traps dug under cover of darkness. Over the next week, the Soviets launched 5 frontal assaults. All were repelled. Inside Narva, the defenders named their positions after loved ones and memories: Anna's Bakery, the Whispering Oak, Marge's Window. Each house became a fortress, each room a redoubt. A radio stolen from a German supply cache broadcast their only link to the outside world. They listened nightly to Allied transmissions and BBC updates, not for orders, none were coming, but for hope. The civilians who remained were few, but those who did shared what they could. A grandmother named Lina brewed pine needle tea to stave off scurvy. 2 teenage boys crafted Molotov cocktails using petrol drained from wrecked trucks. Every evening, Captain Tam would climb to the bell tower of the ruined Lutheran church and scan the horizon with a cracked pair of field glasses. Every evening, he saw more Soviet trucks. On January 23rd, disaster struck. A Soviet artillery shell hit the eastern wall of the schoolhouse being used as a field hospital. 6 wounded fighters died instantly, along with the only medic. Morale plummeted. Some pleaded with Tam to flee westward, to find the retreating Germans or blend into the forests. But Tam stood firm. "If we leave," he said, "our people have nothing. Not from Berlin. Not from Moscow. Here, we decide what we are." The Soviet commander, growing impatient, shifted tactics. On the night of January 28th, under cover of snowfall, Red Army scouts infiltrated the southern approach, planting demolition charges. A small explosion took out one of the last machine gun nests. A breach was imminent. Then came the signal, a green flare fired from the belfry. It was time. The final charges under the bridge were lit by a young Estonian engineer named Willem, who had hidden with his family during the early German invasion. As Soviet troops began to storm across the bridge, the blast echoed like thunder across the frozen landscape. The central span collapsed, plunging 2 Soviet tanks and over 30 infantrymen into the icy river below. But the cost was high. The explosion also destroyed their last route of escape. By February 2nd, Soviet forces fully encircled Narva. The defenders now fought room to room, house to house. Captain Tam was last seen on the morning of February 4th, bleeding from a shoulder wound, directing the evacuation of wounded into the catacombs beneath the church. On February 5th, Soviet forces declared the town secured. Of the 120 original defenders, fewer than 30 were captured alive. The rest had died, vanished into the woods, or taken their own lives rather than surrender. Among the ruins, Soviet troops found journals, bloodied uniforms bearing neither swastikas nor hammers and sickles, and one haunting sign scrawled in charcoal on a burned wall: "Not for Germany. Not for Russia. For us." The Battle of Narva Bridge was never reported in official Soviet communiques. It was buried, like so many other inconvenient stories, under layers of propaganda. The Nazis, in retreat, had no interest in broadcasting the heroism of men they saw as expendable. And when the Iron Curtain fell across Eastern Europe, Estonia's brief flicker of resistance was silenced. But decades later, after independence was restored in 1991, local historians began to uncover fragments of the story: scraps of correspondence, bone fragments, bullet-ridden helmets buried in the snow. Today, near the new Narva Bridge, a small plaque bears an inscription in Estonian: "To those who held the line when the world turned away." No generals. No parades. Just the memory of those who fought, not for empires, but for the narrow strip of land they called home. The winter of 1943 settled over Paris like a suffocating curtain. The Seine ran slow and gray beneath low-hanging clouds, and every street carried the echo of boots, German boots. Beneath the heavy silence of occupation, music still drifted through the city, soft and mournful. It came from a small concert hall in Montmartre, where the acclaimed cellist Elise Dubois performed once a week for Nazi officers, Vichy collaborators, and the few Parisians desperate to feel something other than fear. To the audience, she was a silent prodigy, flawless in posture, emotionless in expression, her music more ghost than melody. But behind those stoic eyes and elegant bows was a woman living a lie so dangerous it defied imagination. Elise Dubois was not just a musician. She was a spy. And the cello was her weapon. Her codename was Violinist, a misnomer born of bureaucratic confusion when she was first recruited by the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, in early 1942. Fluent in English and German, she had been discovered by a British agent attending a chamber recital in neutral Geneva. Within months, Elise had undergone training in sabotage, cryptography, and covert communication. But her greatest gift remained what it had always been: her music. Her mission was singular: act as a courier between British intelligence and the growing cells of the French resistance in northern France. But instead of using satchels, codes typed on silk, or hidden compartments in shoe soles, Elise used the only thing no one ever suspected: her sheet music. Each performance was carefully orchestrated. Her cello compositions were laced with coded notations embedded into the tempo markings or dynamic expressions. Adagio, at the wrong place, might mean an attack was planned. A sudden shift to fortissimo, where the music should be soft, might signal a safe house had been compromised. Her contacts, often disguised as waiters, janitors, or even orchestra members, would retrieve the scores after each concert. Her handler, a resistance fighter known only as Le Drapeau, coordinated rendezvous via musical references. A note tucked into a bouquet of violets might say Beethoven's Fifth, which meant a meeting near the Fifth Arrondissement. A request to perform Debussy? It meant someone had been arrested and the network was shifting. Every concert was a dance with death. German officers adored her. One, Major Heinrich Kohl, was particularly enamored, attending nearly every performance, offering champagne, asking questions about her technique, her family, her loyalties. Elise smiled, bowed, answered vaguely, and never let her eyes betray her. She knew Kohl had executed a resistance courier the month before. She had found the man's body on the banks of the Seine, his hands broken and face unrecognizable. Elise did not grieve. She practiced harder. In March 1943, Elise received a directive of unprecedented importance. A British reconnaissance plane had captured blurry photographs of a massive German installation in northern France. Concrete domes, fuel tanks, strange launching rails. Intelligence suspected it was a V-weapon facility, possibly for a new type of rocket. Elise was to pass a message to a resistance team near Calais and confirm the coordinates for a bombing raid. The message, compressed into 3 lines of a Chopin nocturne, was added to her performance program for a spring gala organized by the German Cultural Ministry. It would be attended by half a dozen high-ranking officers, including General von Trittl himself, rumored to be overseeing the V-weapon project. The event was scheduled for April 2nd. On the night of the gala, the theater glowed with candlelight and perfume. Elise wore a deep burgundy gown, her cello polished like obsidian. As she took her place and began the nocturne, the hall fell into reverent silence. Each note was placed precisely, the coded message flowing beneath the surface like a whisper in a crowd. But halfway through the performance, her eyes caught a movement, a man slipping out the side door, a violinist who had never played a note. She knew something was wrong. When the curtain fell and applause thundered around her, Elise forced a bow and fled to her dressing room. There, she found Call waiting. He wasn't smiling. "We intercepted a courier," he said, voice low. "He had this." He held up her sheet music. Elise froze. She glanced at the pages. They were not the doctored ones. Someone had switched them. Call stepped closer. "You're talented, Fräulein Dubois. It would be a shame to see you waste such gifts for a country that cannot protect you." Elise's breath came shallow. "I play for beauty, Major. Not politics." Call studied her. Then, to her surprise, he stepped back. "The concert was moving. Let's not ruin the mood. Go home." He let her leave. That night, she ran. Her contact had clearly been compromised. The resistance was fractured. But the mission was not over. With what little she had, she made contact with Le Drapeau through an emergency channel, a dead drop hidden in the crumbling bricks of the Pont Neuf. The final message was passed without music. No cello, no concert, no applause. Just a thin slip of paper tucked into a hollow stone. The RAF bombed the facility 10 days later. But Elise would not see it. 2 days after the drop, she was captured by the Gestapo. Not Call's men, he had mysteriously vanished, but by agents with orders from Berlin. Her flat had been ransacked. Her cello smashed. She was interrogated in the basement of a prison on Rue de la Santé. Tortured. Questioned. Beaten. But she said nothing. In June 1944, during the chaos of the Allied invasion, Elise was loaded onto a train bound for Ravensbrück. She did not arrive. Somewhere near Reims, the train was sabotaged by resistance fighters. Amid the wreckage, no body was found. Some say she died in the fire. Others claim she escaped and fled south, living under an assumed name. One rumor insists she made it to London and lived out her life teaching music under a false identity. In a museum in Cannes today, a scorched cello stands behind glass. Beside it, a plaque reads, Elise Dubois, 1912 to 1944, presumed. Musician, courier, patriot. Her concerts have long since ended. But the silent notes she played carried messages more powerful than any words, and saved lives, even as hers slipped quietly into history's shadows. The sun rose like a hammer over the Libyan desert, casting brutal shadows across a landscape that seemed purpose-built for war. In 1942, the Western Desert had become a theater of dust, blood, and illusions. While Rommel's Afrika Korps stalked toward the Nile and the British Eighth Army fought for every grain of sand, a secret operation unfolded behind the dunes. It was called Project Sandstorm, a deception campaign so audacious and bizarre that it almost never left the drawing board. The idea began with a man named Captain Reginald Ainsworth, a former theater set designer turned Royal Engineers officer. Known for his flair with fabrics and an unhealthy obsession with perspective, Ainsworth had been stationed in Cairo with little to do but complain about the tea. But one night, over gin and cynicism, he sketched an absurd idea on a napkin. What if the Germans attacked a shadow? That sketch reached Lieutenant Colonel Percy Hobart, an eccentric tank theorist with connections to British High Command. Within weeks, Ainsworth found himself leading a new unit, the 319th Combat Engineering Battalion, a patchwork of sappers, stagehands, and failed architects tasked with fooling the most dangerous field marshal in the Axis, Erwin Rommel. Their mission: build an entire fake armored division in the desert to mislead Axis reconnaissance ahead of the Second Battle of El Alamein. They had 3 months, a handful of actual tanks, and an unlimited supply of canvas, wood, rubber, and sand. The plan was outrageous. Inflatable tanks would be set up across a 15-mile stretch, complete with fake treadmarks made by dragging iron rakes behind mules. Dummy fuel depots were painted on empty drums. Fake command tents had chimneys with smoke produced by burning camel dung soaked in oil. Radio operators transmitted gibberish-coded transmissions to mimic division chatter. At night, lanterns blinked in patterns mimicking the refueling of trucks. It was theater on a military scale. But the piece de resistance was the Growler, a wooden replica of a Matilda tank mounted on the back of a flatbed lorry. Its exhaust pipe whistled. Its turret rotated with a pulley. It even recoiled when its fake gun fired blanks. Local Bedouin tribes were paid in tea and sugar to spread rumors of a new British desert armor moving south. At first, no one believed it would work. The heat warped the inflatable tanks. The sand chewed through cables. A windstorm carried an entire field of dummy artillery 2 kilometers east, where it was discovered by a confused patrol goat. But Ainsworth was relentless. Every problem was met with theatrical improvisation. Meanwhile, Rommel, who relied heavily on Luftwaffe reconnaissance, began to receive conflicting intelligence. Reports showed massing armor and fuel stockpiles near Burkatara, a location previously thought to be lightly defended. He diverted his limited panzer divisions south to prepare for what appeared to be an imminent British thrust. The real British attack, led by General Montgomery, would come from the north. As October approached, Ainsworth and his engineers ramped up the illusion. They staged entire mock battles at dusk, using loudspeakers to broadcast tank engine noise and artillery fire. Explosives were set off to simulate impact zones. Even the sand was manipulated, mounds shoveled by hand to create the illusion of fortifications. It was madness wrapped in discipline. But there were setbacks. On October 16th, a German reconnaissance plane crash-landed near one of the dummy fuel depots. A British patrol reached the wreck first, capturing the pilot. To their horror, he had sketches of their inflatable tanks. It seemed the ruse had been discovered. The pilot was interrogated. He spoke little English but enough to say, "Your tanks, very strange, no tracks." Ainsworth feared the operation was blown. But then something strange happened. Instead of retreating, Rommel doubled down on his southern deployment, moving even more armor to the decoy front. British intelligence learned the pilot had filed his reconnaissance report before crashing, and his superiors believed it. They thought the bizarre tanks were simply part of new British camouflage techniques. Montgomery launched the real assault on October 23rd. Operation Lightfoot smashed through the northern German line, where defenses had been weakened. Rommel's tanks, caught out of position, scrambled to reposition but were outpaced. The Axis line collapsed within days. Project Sandstorm had worked. In the aftermath, Ainsworth and the 319th were quietly disbanded. Their success was kept classified for years, buried beneath the official narratives of grit and firepower. When asked in later years how many tanks he actually had in the desert, Ainsworth once joked, "More than Hitler thought and fewer than Montgomery wished." Many of the men returned to civilian life with no medals, no citations. Ainsworth resumed his stage career in London, designing sets for war-themed plays that audiences believed were fiction. His favorite production was The Battle That Wasn't, a thinly veiled nod to El Alamein that few understood. Today, buried in a forgotten annex of the Imperial War Museum, there sits a deflated rubber tank, faded from sun and torn by time. Beside it, a plaque reads, "This object never fired a shot." but it helped win a war. In the end, it wasn't just guns or grit that turned the tide in North Africa. It was sand, canvas, illusion, and a group of madmen who understood that sometimes, in war, the greatest weapon is the lie you convince your enemy to believe. The Northern Sea is a graveyard. In the winter of 1942, Convoy PX-61 left the harbor at Reykjavik, Iceland, bound for Murmansk in the Soviet Union. Its mission was critical: deliver fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and winter uniforms to Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. The Arctic convoys were among the most dangerous assignments of the war, passing through the frigid, storm-racked waters north of Norway, where German U-boats and aircraft prowled like wolves. PX-61 was supposed to be a routine reinforcement convoy: 8 merchant ships, 2 British destroyers, and a corvette retrofitted with sonar. It departed on November 3 under overcast skies, radio silent and cloaked in polar darkness. But what made PX-61 unique, what made it infamous, was that it never arrived. No distress signals were sent. No wreckage was found. Not a single crewman was recovered. It vanished, completely, into the ice and fog. What followed was one of the most secretive and disturbing investigations ever undertaken by the Royal Navy. Documents remained sealed for decades, and many involved never spoke of it again. Only now, after partial declassification, can the pieces of PX-61's final voyage be reconstructed, and the mystery explored. The last confirmed sighting of the convoy came on November 5, when a British patrol plane flying from Jan Mayen Island reported the vessel sailing in tight formation, moving eastward under heavy snowfall. Conditions were normal, except for one strange detail. The plane's crew noted that the destroyer HMS Ravelin was flying no flag. Naval protocol demanded identification in such narrow waters. The pilot noted the omission but was instructed not to engage. That was the last anyone saw of PX-61. By November 10, with no contact from the convoy, the Admiralty grew anxious. U-boat activity had been minimal in that sector, and Luftwaffe bombers had reported nothing. Search patrols were launched from Scapa Flow and Arkhangelsk. Soviet intelligence was informed. Weeks passed. Nothing. Then, on December 3, a Soviet trawler radioed a cryptic message: wreckage at Franz Josef Land. No survivors. 1 crate recovered. British intelligence immediately dispatched a retrieval team under the cover of night. What they found was chilling. The crate, encased in ice, bore a British military stamp, but not one associated with standard munitions. It was labeled PX-61, B-12, Priority Experimental Cargo, Do Not Open. The crate was flown to a remote naval installation in the Shetland Islands and placed under guard. No official record of its contents exists, but an officer who witnessed the inspection later wrote in his private journal that the crate contained metal cylinders filled with green fluid, a sealed ledger in Russian, and one large photograph of what appeared to be a mountain facility. No explanation followed. Amid growing confusion, whispers began circulating in intelligence circles. A few claimed the convoy was transporting biochemical materials developed in joint British-Soviet research. Others believed PX-61 carried parts of a downed German V-2 rocket retrieved from a crash in Sweden, rocket parts the Soviets wanted, and the British did not want falling into Nazi hands. The most outlandish theory suggested that the convoy had intercepted an encrypted German transmission about a northern anomaly, a distortion of magnetism or time somewhere along the 75th parallel. In the absence of facts, superstition filled the void. Among the documents recovered with the crate was a weather log, partially burned, marked by entries in 2 different handwritings. The last entry, dated November 6, read simply, "Fog persistent. All compasses spinning. Ravelin communicating with itself on private frequency. Request clarification. Morale low." The suggestion that a British destroyer had been sending radio messages to its own call sign sent shivers down the spines of even the most rational minds in the Admiralty. Was it a technical error? A captured ship? Or something far stranger? By early 1943, the file on PX-61 was closed, labeled Operational Loss, Unknown Circumstances. But the story didn't end there. In 1951, during a NATO training exercise off the coast of Norway, the sonar operator aboard the HMS Valiant detected what he believed was a convoy moving under the ice. 4 distinct pings, ship-sized shapes, drifting in formation beneath the Arctic crust. But when divers were dispatched, they found nothing. Later that year, Soviet fishermen claimed to have seen a ghostly ship drifting between ice floes near Novaya Zemlya. They described it as a black freighter, silent, lights flickering, its deck covered in ice and no crew visible. It vanished into a fog bank moments later. None of these reports were confirmed, but they gave rise to the nickname, the Ghost Convoy. Some say PX-61 fell victim to a German experimental weapon, perhaps a magnetic mine or acoustic device that disoriented the ships and led them off course into the ice, where they froze and sank without a trace. Others believe the convoy stumbled upon a Soviet installation so secret that Moscow chose to eliminate them rather than risk exposure. A darker theory suggests internal betrayal. That someone on board, possibly Soviet agents embedded in the crew, sabotaged the convoy mid-journey, redirecting the most vital cargo to another destination. This might explain the recovered crate and the altered log entries. But perhaps the most haunting possibility is that PX-61 simply disappeared. Swallowed by the Arctic, consumed by a region that had already taken hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. A place where reality bends under cold and pressure, where even steel cracks like bone. Today, Convoy PX-61 is memorialized only in a small plaque at the Royal Naval Museum in Portsmouth, listing the names of the 232 men presumed lost. No bodies were ever recovered. No hulls raised. No flags returned. Just the legend of a convoy that vanished without a fight, without a message, into the silence north of the world. A reminder that, in war, not all losses are witnessed, and not all ghosts come from the grave. By the spring of 1945, the skies above the Pacific were thick with smoke and sorrow. Japan stood battered, its cities firebombed to ash, its navy broken, its empire crumbling island by island under the weight of American might. In the southern reaches of Kyushu, at an isolated airfield near Kagoshima, a final chapter of fanatic devotion and desperate defiance was being written. The base was called Tachibana 3, and it was home to the 318th Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekutai, Kamikaze Special Attack Unit ***. Among its pilots was Lieutenant Haruki Sato, a 22-year-old poetry student from Kyoto University, whose love of cherry blossoms and quiet mornings had once promised him a life of letters, not death in a cockpit. Haruki had never envisioned himself as a soldier. He had joined the Imperial Navy under conscription, serving first as a mechanic before transferring to pilot school. He was bright, obedient, and quiet, qualities that drew the attention of the base commander, Captain Moriya, who saw in him the perfect candidate for Japan's Honorable Death Corps. The training was brief. A month of technical drills. A week of ideological lectures. A day to say goodbye. Haruki had no family left, his parents killed during the Tokyo firebombing the year before. He received his final orders on April 2nd, along with a ceremonial headband, a vial of sake, and a letter supposedly written by Emperor Hirohito himself, urging his faithful sons to become the sword that pierces the heart of the American demon. Haruki did not believe in demons. He believed in his country. But his heart, even in those final days, was filled not with fire, but with doubt. He began keeping a journal, a dangerous act. In it, he wrote not of glory or vengeance, but of clouds, silence, the shape of the earth below. He wrote of the moments before dawn, when the wind felt like breath and the airbase still smelled of pine. I wonder, he wrote on April 5th, if the Americans also write poems before battle. His aircraft was a modified Mitsubishi Zero, packed with a 250 kilograms bomb fused to explode on impact. The plane bore the name Sakura 19, painted in red ink across the fuselage. His assigned target was an American carrier believed to be stationed near Okinawa. It didn't matter if the intelligence was right. Kamikaze missions did not rely on return. On the evening before his mission, the base held a farewell ceremony. Haruki and 7 other pilots lined up as the national anthem played over the loudspeakers. Women from the local village, dressed in white, handed out chrysanthemums and tearful smiles. Captain Moriya stood before them and said, "You will become gods. The sea will carry your names forever." But Haruki did not feel divine. That night, he went to the hangar alone and sat beneath his aircraft. He lit a cigarette and stared at the Sakura tree that had survived the last air raid, its pink blossoms fluttering in the moonlight like bits of torn paper. The next morning, they launched at 0415 hours. 4 zeros roared into the sky, carrying 8 young men whose names had already been carved into memorial stones. Haruki flew second in formation, his hands steady on the controls, his eyes scanning the ocean ahead. 2 hours into the flight, anti-aircraft fire erupted from a destroyer that appeared suddenly from beneath a veil of cloud. One plane, Sakura, 22, was hit and exploded midair. Another veered off course, possibly due to engine failure. That left Haruki and one other, Ensign Genda, barely 19. As they approached the supposed carrier location, the sky was empty. No fleet. No enemy. Only whitecaps and wind. It had been a false report. Haruki did not turn back. Instead, he dropped altitude and signaled to Genda, 3 flashes of his wing light, the signal for abort. Genda ignored it and accelerated eastward, disappearing over the horizon. Haruki circled once, then again. Below him, the sea churned like oil. He was alone. No enemy to die for. No glory to claim. He thought of his mother's voice, the scent of ink on paper, the taste of oranges in spring. He turned his aircraft northwest, toward Japan. It was an unforgivable act. Back at Tachibana 3, his return was met not with relief but fury. Captain Moriya struck him across the face, screaming that he had desecrated the Emperor's will. "Coward," he spat. "Better you had drowned." Haruki was arrested. The military police wanted to execute him for desertion, but the war was collapsing too quickly. Okinawa fell weeks later. American bombers flew over Kagoshima daily. Tachibana 3 was abandoned by late June. In the chaos, Haruki disappeared. Some say he was executed in secret. Others believe he escaped into the forests with help from a sympathetic mechanic. One account, written decades later by a retired Navy officer, claimed Haruki made it to the southern port of Makurazaki and stowed away on a fishing vessel under a false name. No official record confirms his fate. After the war, Japan changed. The shrines to kamikaze pilots were left to fade. The military archives burned or buried. But in 1971, during renovations at a temple near Kyoto, a journal was discovered sealed inside a wooden box, wrapped in silk. It contained 47 pages of poetry, musings, and confessions. The final entry read, "If death is to be beautiful, let it come with meaning. But if meaning is stolen by madness, let life remain, quietly, stubbornly, like a flower blooming in a graveyard." The journal was never publicly attributed, but some believe it belonged to Haruki Sato, the kamikaze pilot who chose to live. Today, at the Peace Museum in Chiran, there is a replica of a Zero plane with cherry blossoms painted across its side. Children walk by, their hands full of questions. Some stop and stare, and among the names etched in the memorial wall, one space remains curiously blank. The space where a ghost whispers not of war, but of doubt. He was meant to explode into history, a nameless fireball in the sky. Instead, he became a question no one dared ask. In a war that demanded sacrifice without thought, one man hesitated. And that hesitation, hidden for decades, now haunts the ashes of empire. Some stories aren't forgotten, they're buried on purpose.